Episode 1 ended on the most unsettling implication. A figure the tradition barely named but could never stop managing. This episode begins one step earlier and one layer deeper. Before the Hebrew word entered the tradition, the demonological profile behind it was already centuries old, documented in cuneiform, feared by institutional practitioners, subject to systematic medical and ritual management in the most sophisticated religious civilization of the ancient world. The question is not where Lilith came from. The question is what she actually was before the tradition that eventually named her reduced her to a single verse in a desolation oracle. Because the answer to that question is not what the mythology suggests. It is far more specific, far more institutional, and far stranger. By the end of this video, you will understand the full taxonomy of the Mesopotamian Lilu demon family: Lilu, Lilitu, and Ardat Lili, and the specific cuneiform, medical, and exorcistic literature in which they appear. You will understand what the Babylonian tradition believed these figures actually did and why. You will understand the role of the Maqlu anti-witchcraft ritual series and why its presence in Neo-Babylonian scribal schools during the period of Jewish exile is not a coincidence. You will understand what the specific mechanism of cultural transmission from Babylon to Judah actually looked like in the daily life of exiled communities. And you will understand why the transformation from Babylonian ritual medical disease agent to Jewish biographical individual is one of the most consequential religious inheritances the ancient world produced. The Babylonian tradition treated Lilitu as a ritual medical problem. She had a diagnostic profile. She had prescribed treatments. She had institutional practitioners dedicated to her management. The Jewish tradition eventually took that inherited profile and converted it into a person, an individual with a name, a story, a grievance, and a negotiated agreement with the divine order. That conversion is not a trivial development. It is evidence of two completely different theological grammars operating on the same raw material. Understanding which grammar produced which figure, and why the Jewish grammar produced a person where the Babylonian grammar produced a type, is the only way to understand what the tradition that gave us the first wife of Adam was actually doing. The Babylonian series of exorcistic texts known as Maqlu, a word meaning burning, is the most comprehensive anti-witchcraft ritual literature Mesopotamia produced. It fills 9 tablets. It prescribes an extended overnight ritual sequence performed by formally trained exorcists. It names and expels specific demonic agents in precise ritual order. It was still in active use in the Neo-Babylonian period, the precise period when Jewish exiles were living and working inside Babylonian cities, inside Babylonian administrative culture, inside Babylonian scribal education. The Maqlu series includes Lilitu among the figures to be expelled. The Mesopotamian demonological tradition is not a collection of folklore. It is a medical and theological system with its own internal logic, its own taxonomy, and its own institutional infrastructure. By the end of this chapter, you will understand the structural position Lilitu occupied within that system. And why the diagnostic precision of that position is the first evidence that what later became Lilith was always something more specific than a general fear of the dark. The ancient Babylonian understanding of illness was not a failure to grasp biology. It was a structured explanatory system in which physical pathology and supernatural agency operated simultaneously and without contradiction. A man who fell ill might have visible physical symptoms, and those symptoms could also be read as the intervention of a demonic agent who had entered through a window threshold at night. These explanations were not competing. They were layers of the same event, addressed by two complementary practitioners, the Ashipu, the exorcist, and the Asu, the physician. The Ashipu identified and expelled the demonic agent. The Asu treated the physical manifestation. Neither made the other redundant. In this system, to understand a disease was to understand both its physical mechanism and its supernatural cause. And the supernatural cause had a taxonomy as precise as anything in modern diagnostic classification. That taxonomy distinguished between divine beings, semi-divine beings, demonic agents, and disease-causing entities. The distinction mattered because it determined the appropriate response. You do not address a god with the same ritual language you use to expel a disease agent. You do not treat a named demon the same way you treat an anonymous pathological force. The Babylonian exorcistic tradition was, above all, a tradition of precise identification, and precision required categories. Within this taxonomy, the concept of the liminally placed threat was foundational. Demons in Babylonian thought were not general presences of evil. They operated at specific boundaries, thresholds, windows, doorways, the margins between the ordered domestic interior and the unordered space beyond. The night was not simply darkness in Babylonian religious thought. It was a juridical space, the hours outside the ordered light of the divine, during which protective structures that held during the day were weakened, and the supervised boundary between the domestic and the dangerous became permeable. This liminal theology shaped the entire iconographic vocabulary of Babylonian dangerous power. Protective hybrid creatures, the Lamašû, bull-bodied and human-headed, positioned at the gates of temples and palaces, were placed precisely at thresholds because the threshold was where danger entered. The Ugalu, the lion demon, guarded against the intrusion that the liminal moment invited. And within this broader tradition of hybrid creatures marking the boundaries of ordered space, the winged female demon type carried specific connotations. Predatory avian attributes, combined with female form, encoded a particular category of transgressive, dangerous power. The feminine as the nocturnal, the aerial, the intrusive. Within this broader system, the Lilu family occupied a specific and precisely defined position. The Lilu was a male wind demon, associated with the storm, with the erratic and uncontrolled movement of air, with sudden illness attributed to atmospheric intrusion. The Lilitu was his female counterpart, nocturnal in her specific operations, associated with wind in its nighttime aspect, with the unguarded hour and the unprotected threshold. The Ardat Lili, the Maid of the Wind, the Wind's handmaid, was a related but distinct figure, not precisely the same entity as the Lilitu, though the scholarship sometimes treats the terms loosely. Each member of the Lilu family had specific functions and specific modes of harm, and the precision of those functions is one of the most important features of the tradition. What made Lilitu specifically dangerous within this taxonomy was not generic supernatural malevolence. It was her specific operational profile. She entered at night through windows and thresholds, the liminal points, the protective tradition guarded most intensively. Her specific targets were men during sleep, erotic disturbance, physical debilitation, and women of childbearing age. The figure most sharply defined around pregnancy and infant threat in Babylonian thought is Lamaštu. Lilitu's profile is nocturnal, afflictive, and liminal. The precision of this profile is not incidental. It is a diagnostic classification. It tells the exorcist what he is dealing with, where she operates, when she operates, and what protective and curative measures apply. The Babylonian apparatus for managing this figure was not limited to household charms or casual protective practice. It developed over centuries into a formal institutional system with specialist practitioners, curriculum-level textual transmission, and ritual sequences of a complexity that demanded professional training. The most formal expression of that apparatus fills 9 tablets and prescribes an extended overnight ritual sequence performed by trained institutional specialists. That apparatus has not yet been described. What the Cuneiform record preserves, and what the next chapter will make specific, is that Lilitu was not a marginal figure in this tradition. She was a documented, classified, diagnostically profiled threat, managed by the most sophisticated religious civilization of the ancient world, with the same institutional seriousness it brought to every other domain of its ordered life. The diagnostic record of what Lilitu actually did is preserved in that cuneiform, and it is far more specific than anything the later tradition's biography suggests. The cuneiform evidence for Lilitu and Ardat Lili spans medical diagnostic texts, exorcistic ritual series, and personal protection literature. By the end of this chapter, you will understand what each genre reveals about the figure, and why the diagnostic precision of the Babylonian record is one of the strongest arguments that the Hebrew tradition inherited something specific, not something vague. The SA.GIG diagnostic series is Babylonian medicine at its most systematic. The title is Akkadian shorthand for a longer phrase meaning roughly, "if the sick man." It is a clinical handbook, a sequence of conditional diagnostic entries that proceed from head to foot through every category of illness a practitioner might encounter. Each entry identifies a symptom or cluster of symptoms, names the responsible agent, and in many cases, prescribes the appropriate treatment. Scholars have described it as the most comprehensive medical text the ancient world produced before the Hippocratic corpus. And it names the Lilu family within its diagnostic apparatus. The relevant material associates members of the Lilu family with nocturnal affliction, erotic disturbance in men, and bodily debilitation. Related Babylonian traditions address reproductive and infant danger, but the figure most sharply and iconographically defined around pregnancy and newborn threat is Lamaštu. Lilitu's strongest diagnostic profile is nocturnal, afflictive, and threshold-based. The tradition is not describing a vague evil. It is describing a specific pathological agent with a specific profile, specific targets, and specific clinical presentations. And it is prescribing responses calibrated to that specific profile. This is not mythology in any popular sense of the word. It is a diagnostic literature. The Ardat Lili occupies a related but distinct position in this record. Tzvi Abush's analysis in Mesopotamian Witchcraft, 2002, is the definitive scholarly treatment. Abush argues that the Ardat Lili is fundamentally a figure of frustrated social completion. A young woman who died unmarried and unfulfilled, whose failure to achieve the social structures that give life its order becomes the source of her demonic function. The Babylonian theological logic is specific. The incomplete do not simply cease, they persist. And they persist with a particular orientation toward what they were denied: the domestic, the reproductive, the relational. The Ardat Lili did not become dangerous through corruption or rebellion. She became dangerous through the accumulated weight of what she never received. That is a precise theological claim about the relationship between social structure and supernatural agency. And it is embedded in the Cuneiform record, centuries before the Hebrew tradition produced any corresponding figure. Now, 9 tablets, an extended overnight ritual sequence, formally trained Ashipu, performing systematic naming, and expulsion of demonic agents. Specific figures called by name in precise ritual order before a witness in a fire. This is not a household charm. This is not a folk incantation whispered over a newborn. This is a professional curriculum. This is institutional practice at the highest level of Babylonian religious life. This is the Maqlu series. The Maqlu series, its title derived from the Akkadian word for burning, is the most comprehensive anti-witchcraft and anti-demonic ritual literature the ancient world has left us. Its 9 tablets contain incantations, ritual instructions, mythological narratives, and precise procedural sequences spanning an extended nocturnal ritual performance. The ritual was performed by an Ashipu working on behalf of a client who believed themselves afflicted by witchcraft or demonic attack. It was not a private or domestic rite. It was a formal professional procedure conducted by a practitioner who had trained in the scribal schools where this text was part of the curriculum. Maqlu includes Lilu, Lilitu, and Ardat Lili among the many demonic figures named in its anti-witchcraft apparatus. Not as its primary subject, but as part of the systematic, demonological world the series addresses. The institutional context of that appearance cannot be overstated. The Maqlu series was not exotic or marginal in Neo-Babylonian scribal culture. It was copied and recopied across generations of scribal education. It circulated within the scholarly and scribal world associated with advanced ritual training. The Lamaštu tradition runs parallel to the Lilitu tradition, but is distinct in crucial ways, and understanding the distinction matters for what follows. Walter Farber's definitive edition, Lamaštu, in edition 2014, establishes her profile with precision. Lamaštu is not a disease agent class in the same sense as Lilitu. She is a divine figure, a daughter of the high god Anu, who was cast from heaven for her murderous appetites. She attacks pregnant women and nursing mothers. She targets newborns. Her iconography is specific and terrifying. Lion-headed, with the feet of a bird of prey, nursing a dog and a pig at her breasts while holding serpents. Her amulet tradition is elaborate. Small plaques depicting Pazuzu repelling Lamaštu were worn by pregnant women and placed near newborns as protective objects. Here is where a comfortable explanation presents itself. The Babylonian demonological world contained many figures targeting reproductive and infant vulnerabilities. Lilitu is one of several. The phonetic resemblance between the Akkadian Lilitu and the Hebrew Layil, night, may be all the transmission required. The Hebrew lilit is a linguistic accident, not a religious inheritance. The figure was absorbed because its name fitted, not because of any deeper theological affinity. An etymology is not a theology. It is a clean argument. It has the appeal of parsimony, the simplest mechanism producing the observed result. And it is insufficient. Phonetic resemblance does not explain why the specific functional profile of Lilitu, the nocturnal male visitation, the afflictive threshold crossing, maps so precisely onto later Jewish Lilith. Phonetic resemblance does not explain why the amulet tradition, which predates the full biography by centuries, operates in a recognizably related protective grammar. Name the threat, invoke higher authority, establish conditions, and enforce protection through written ritual technology. The three-angel agreement that Episode 1 described is not a simple copy of Babylonian practice. The personnel have changed, the theology has changed, but it operates with a related logic. The grammar is related, not identical, and that relationship cannot be explained by an etymological accident alone. The transmission was not an accident. It was the product of sustained cultural contact between communities who shared the same demonological fears and encountered each other's management systems in the course of daily life. The phonetic resemblance may have created a bridge, but a bridge requires two shores, and the shore on the Babylonian side was built from centuries of diagnostic practice, scribal transmission, and institutional infrastructure. But there is a figure in that Babylonian world who overlaps with the later Lilith in ways that demand explanation. A figure who in some respects looks more like the eventual Jewish Lilith than Lilitu herself does. Lamaštu is divine, cast from heaven, murderous, female, and the subject of an elaborate protective tradition involving demonic intercessors. She did not cross into Jewish tradition as a named figure in any comparable form. Understanding why illuminates what the transmission actually selected. Lilitu did not operate alone. The Babylonian demonological world had an entire ecosystem of dangerous female power, and understanding where Lilitu sits within it, and why some figures in that ecosystem crossed into the Jewish tradition while others did not. is the clearest evidence available for what the transmission actually selected and why. Pazuzu is one of the most structurally interesting figures in the Babylonian demonological world for precisely this reason. He is monstrous, lion-headed, bird-footed, serpent-bodied, with a face that ancient Mesopotamian religious art made deliberately grotesque. He is a wind demon of the worst kind, associated with plague-bearing winds from the southwest, with fever, with the worst that the uncontrolled atmosphere could deliver. And yet, he was deployed, consistently and formally, as a protective figure against Lamaštu. The paradox is not a contradiction, it is a structural logic. A more immediately dangerous monster was repelled by a less immediately dangerous one. One who, for reasons that the texts preserve only partially, had a specific enmity toward Lamaštu, or a specific power over her. Pazuzu amulets, small pendants bearing his image, sometimes with inscriptions invoking his protective function, were worn during pregnancy and placed near infants. They did not ward off Pazuzu. They invoked Pazuzu against Lamaštu. Anyone who has read about Senoi, Sansenoi, and Semangelof in the amulet tradition, described in Episode 1, will recognize this structural logic. 3 figures, not benevolent in any simple sense, but wielding specific authority over the threatening figure. Invoked on protective amulets addressed to a dangerous female entity who attacks newborns and makes a conditional agreement under pressure. The 3-angel agreement operates in a recognizably related protective grammar. Name the threat, invoke higher authority, establish conditions, enforce protection through written ritual technology. The personnel have changed. The grammar is related, not identical. Lamaštu herself is worth dwelling on, not only because of the structural overlap with later Lilith, but because her profile raises the question that Chapter 2 left open. Farber's edition establishes her as a daughter of Anu, the supreme heaven god, cast down from her divine position because of her murderous appetites. That is a divine fall. She attacks the most vulnerable, the pregnant body, the newborn, the nursing infant. She operates at exactly the domestic threshold that Lilitu inhabits. She has an elaborate protective tradition that treats her as an individual figure who can be managed through ritual address. She is, in multiple respects, the figure who looks most like the biographical Lilith the Jewish tradition eventually produced. And she did not cross. The reason she did not cross is itself significant. Lamaštu's profile is explicitly physiological in a way that the Lilitu tradition is not. Her attacks are on the body in its most vulnerable physical states: the pregnant uterus, the nursing infant, the postpartum woman. Her iconography encodes physical threat with graphic directness. Lilitu's threat, by contrast, is primarily nocturnal and experiential. She operates through sleep, through erotic disturbance, through the permeable boundary of consciousness. That distinction maps onto a difference in what the Jewish tradition found theologically portable. A figure associated with night, with the unguarded threshold of consciousness, with the gap between domestic order and what lies outside it. That is a figure whose profile translates across a theological boundary. A divine demoness with lion teeth who physically attacks the pregnant body, is a figure whose profile is specifically Babylonian in ways that do not transfer. There is also the question of theological grammar. Lamaštu is a divine figure and a corrupted one. Her fall from heaven is a Babylonian narrative about what happens when divine power goes wrong. The Jewish tradition had its own fallen divine theology, but it was organized differently. The Watchers of the Enochic tradition, Samael, the adversarial figures of the divine court. Lamaštu did not fit any of those categories in a way that made her theologically assimilable. Lilitu, by contrast, was a disease agent class, a type, not a person, which meant the Jewish theological grammar could do something to her that it could not do to a named divine figure with a specific mythological biography. It could make her into someone. The Babylonian demonological world's most formally documented dangerous female figure, then, is not the one that eventually became Lilith. Lilitu's profile proved more portable, the diagnostically precise, institutionally managed disease agent type, absorbed by the tradition where the more structurally dramatic Lamaštu was not. That was not arbitrary. It was the result of specific features of the Lilitu profile, the Babylonian transmission mechanism, and the Jewish theological grammar, waiting to receive what was transmitted. What the first 3 chapters have assembled is not a mythology survey. It is not a demonology catalog. It is the evidence base for a single specific claim that the Babylonian tradition managed Lilitu as a systematic medical and theological problem. With institutional infrastructure, specialist practitioners, and curriculum-level textual transmission. Across centuries of documented practice, the second half of this video asks what that system actually transmitted to the Jewish communities living inside it, and why what they received was not the Babylonian system intact, but something the Jewish theological grammar transformed into an entirely different kind of figure. The question is not what Babylon had. It is what the exile actually delivered into the hands of communities who were not passive recipients, but daily participants in the civilization transmitting it. The exile is the mechanism everyone cites and almost nobody examines. By the end of this chapter, you will understand what Jewish communities in Babylon actually encountered, how they encountered it, and why the Maqlu series. The most comprehensive anti-demonic ritual literature the ancient world produced was not an exotic foreign text, but a professional curriculum document present in the scribal environment Jewish exiles could plausibly have encountered as a matter of daily working life. The Maqlu series. We are here. 9 tablets of anti-demonic and anti-witchcraft ritual literature, including Lilu, Lilitu, and Ardat Lili among the figures its apparatus addresses, copied and recopied as scribal curriculum across Neo-Babylonian scribal schools. The question is not whether the Maqlu series existed. The question is how close the Jewish exiles actually were to the world in which it circulated. The answer is inside it. The geography of exile was not the geography of imprisonment. Neo-Babylonian Jewish communities were not confined to ghettos or sealed camps. The al-Yahudu tablets, cuneiform documents recovered from the site of a town called al-Yahudu, meaning City of Judah, situated in the agricultural heartland south of Babylon, preserve the documentary evidence of what exile actually looked like at the level of daily life. These are not theological texts. They are contracts, receipts, loan agreements, and legal records, the commercial paper of a functioning community. Jewish names appear in these documents in their hundreds. Babylonian contracts with Babylonian counterparties, Babylonian administrative procedures, Babylonian legal formulae, operated by families with Hebrew names across multiple generations. The al-Yahudu tablets, published by Pierce and Wunsch in their documentary edition, show Jewish families not observing Babylonian culture from a distance, but embedded in it at the level of daily commercial and administrative life. The Murašû archive extends the picture into the 5th century BCE. The Murašû were a Babylonian banking and agricultural management firm operating in the region of Nippur, and their archive contains hundreds of documents involving Jewish clients, Jewish agents, and Jewish partners. Jewish communities were not merely surviving inside Babylonian civilization, they were commercially integrated into it, operating within its legal and administrative frameworks, participating in its economic life at the level of routine professional transaction. This matters for the transmission question because it establishes proximity. The answer to whether Jewish exiles encountered the Babylonian demonological world is not direct proof of reading, but documented cultural proximity. The same scribal environment that preserved administrative literacy also transmitted ritual and diagnostic knowledge. The Aduba, the Babylonian scribal school, was both the institution that trained the professional class Jewish exiles worked alongside, and the institution that transmitted the Maqlu series as a component of advanced scribal education. The Babylonian scribal curriculum was not narrowly utilitarian. It included literary, mythological, and ritual texts alongside the administrative and mathematical training that produced the professional class. The Maqlu series was not private religious knowledge. It was curriculum. It was the kind of text that Jewish scribes operating in Babylonian administrative contexts could plausibly have encountered. Not necessarily as participants in the rituals it prescribed, but as literate professionals in the world that those rituals organized. What the post-exilic Hebrew texts show is precisely what this proximity predicts. The explosion of Jewish angelology and demonology in the post-exilic period is a documented textual reality. The Hebrew word shed, demon, appears in the Hebrew Bible almost exclusively in post-exilic texts, Deuteronomy 32, Psalm 106, both in contexts pointing to the period of Babylonian influence. The late sections of Zechariah show a cosmological apparatus, heavenly court, divine throne, angelic messengers, adversarial figures, that has no parallel in pre-exilic Hebrew literature. The Enochic tradition, whatever its precise dating, belongs to the world of post-exilic cosmological elaboration. The vocabulary of the exile is visible in the texts that follow it. What was not transmitted is equally significant. The Babylonian ritual sequences themselves did not cross intact. The Pazuzu amulet system, as a Babylonian formal practice, did not become a Jewish formal practice. The Lamaštu management apparatus, with its specific iconography and its divine figure mythology, did not produce a corresponding Jewish figure. What crossed was not the Babylonian system, but the fear the system was managing, and a set of functional categories, protective logics, and demonic profiles that the Jewish tradition received without the Babylonian explanatory framework that had organized them. The Maqlu series named the Lilu family in a professional curriculum circulating in the scribal schools of the world Jewish exiles inhabited during the most formative period of Jewish demonological development. The profile it assigned Lilitu, nocturnal, targeting men in sleep, threshold-based, requiring formal institutional management, is the profile that appears, transformed and individualized, in the Jewish tradition that eventually produced a name, a biography, and a negotiated agreement. The transmission was not accident, and it was not a simple borrowing. It was the result of sustained proximity between a community developing its demonological categories and a civilization whose demonological curriculum had already systematized the same fears into institutional knowledge. What the Jewish tradition received was material. What it did with that material required a different kind of understanding entirely. The kind that only becomes visible when you look at what the Babylonian tradition did not produce. The tradition received from Babylon a type. What it eventually produced was a person. The mechanism of that transformation is not found in the Cuneiform record. It is found in the theological grammar of the tradition that did the transforming. The Babylonian tradition did not originate in Babylon. It inherited and systematized a Sumerian demonological world that is older still. By the end of this chapter, you will understand what the Sumerian evidence contributes to the Lilith question, and where the scholarly limits are. This chapter operates under strict epistemic discipline. The Sumerian evidence is treated as suggestive rather than conclusive. The text known as Inanna and the Huluppu Tree is a Sumerian narrative preserved in the scribal tradition of the early 2nd millennium BCE. In it, the goddess Inanna plants a sacred willow tree in her garden with the intention of eventually fashioning a throne and bed from its wood. When she returns to harvest the tree, she finds it inhabited by 3 unwelcome residents: a serpent at its roots, the anzu bird in its branches, and a figure whose Sumerian designation in some manuscript traditions is read as ki-sikil lil lake, a phrase that some scholars have interpreted as an early Sumerian reference to a figure ancestral to the later Lilitu, and eventually the Hebrew lilit. This identification must be handled with precision. The ki-sikil lil lake reading is contested in the scholarly literature, and the identification with Lilith rests on a chain of interpretive decisions that are plausible but not settled. What is not contested is the narrative structure. A female figure inhabiting the liminal space in Inanna's sacred tree, resistant to the goddess's authority, expelled by the hero Gilgamesh on Inanna's behalf. The structural resonance with later Lilith mythology, the dangerous female at the threshold of divine order, expelled but not destroyed, is clear. Whether that resonance reflects a direct genetic connection or a convergent pattern within the broader Mesopotamian demonological framework is a question the cuneiform evidence cannot resolve with certainty. What is secure is the antiquity of the general framework. The Sumerian tradition had, centuries before the Babylonian elaboration, a well-developed category of liminal female threat. The wind-associated female entity operating at the boundary of the ordered and the unordered. The Lilu family that the Babylonian tradition named and systematized was inheriting a Sumerian conceptual architecture. Whether the specific figure later called Lilitu had a Sumerian predecessor identifiable in the existing texts, or whether the Babylonian tradition generated the Lilitu figure from older Sumerian raw materials without a continuous individual figure traceable through the record, is a question on which Abush and Lambert's scholarship suggests the latter is more defensible. But neither with the confidence that would allow the Ki Sikil Lil Lake identification to be stated as established fact. The Inanna tradition contributes something different and more secure than the Ki Sikil Lil Lake debate. Inanna, who in the later Babylonian tradition becomes Ishtar, is the figure who descends to the underworld and returns, who occupies the liminal space between divine and demonic, between the ordered world of the gods and the unordered world below, who embodies female power at its most dangerous and most generative simultaneously. The Mesopotamian tradition had, in Inanna, a major theological apparatus for thinking about female power at the threshold of the ordered and the dangerous. And that apparatus shaped the entire ecosystem in which Lilitu and Lamaštu and Ardat Lili operated. The Hebrew word in Isaiah 34 is real. Its exact referent in the original text is debated, and translations vary. What matters here is that later, Jewish tradition read that word through a demonological inheritance that had made such a figure intelligible for centuries. And by the time it arrived, the roots extended back through the entire history of Mesopotamian religious thought, Sumerian frameworks for the liminal female threat, Babylonian diagnostic elaboration of a specific demonic type, and a transmission mechanism that had delivered that elaborate tradition to communities actively developing their own theological categories. What the roughly 14 centuries between the Babylonian exile and the medieval Alphabet of Ben Sira produced was not the invention of a figure. It was the generation of an individual from a type. And that generation was not an accident of folklore or a confusion of names. It was a theological grammar doing what theological grammars do. The Jewish tradition did not receive a disease agent category and misread it as a person. It received a disease agent category and, because of the specific grammar of the tradition that received it, a grammar organized around named individuals, specific covenants, personal grievances, and negotiated agreements. It converted that category into the only kind of figure its theological imagination was capable of producing. Not a type, a person, with a name, a story, and terms. The Sumerian background shows how deep the roots go. It does not change what the transformation was. The most significant thing the exile did was not transmit a specific figure. It created the conditions under which a ritual medical disease agent type could become a biographical individual. By the end of this chapter, you will understand the theological grammar shift that performed that transformation. and why it is one of the most consequential inheritances in the history of Western demonology. In Babylonian thought, Lilitu is a type. The Ardat Lili is a class. When the Maqlu series names and expels a demonic agent, it is naming a category, invoking the power of the ritual to address all instances of that category, not engaging in a personal transaction with a specific individual. The logic is categorical. You name the class, you activate the appropriate counter mechanism. You expel whatever instance of the class is present. This is the logic of institutional medicine. It is impersonal in the specific sense that it does not require the figure to have a specific story, a specific grievance, or a specific set of terms on which she can be addressed as an individual with obligations. The Jewish tradition's theological grammar was organized differently at its core. The God of the Hebrew tradition makes individual covenants. He gives individual names. He judges individual acts, holds individuals accountable for specific decisions, and engages in what can only be described as personal relationship. With Abraham, with Moses, with the people as a covenanted collective, with individual kings and prophets and petitioners. A tradition whose primary theological framework is the personal covenant will, when it encounters demonic figures, tend to personalize them. Not because it lacks the categorical thinking that the Babylonian tradition deployed, but because its deepest theological commitments generate a different relationship to individuality. The amulet tradition is the bridge between the Babylonian type and the Jewish individual, and it demonstrates the grammar shift in practice. The amulet texts that predate the Alphabet of Ben Sira's full biography already treat Lilith as an individual. They name her, they address her directly. They invoke a specific contractual agreement, the terms under which she agreed, under divine compulsion, not to harm children, protected by the amulet. That contractual logic is Jewish, not Babylonian. The Babylonian tradition expelled Lilitu by overpowering her categorically. The Jewish tradition bound her by agreement. The difference between those two protective logics is the difference between the two theological grammars, made visible in practical, protective technology. The transformation was not immediate. It moved through stages: word, demon, amulet figure, contractual figure, biography, cosmic consort. The Alphabet of Ben Sira is the resolution of the biographical stage, not the origin of the figure. The Alphabet of Ben Sira is often discussed as if it were the origin point of the Lilith biography, the text that created the story. It is better understood as the resolution of a tension that had been building for centuries. The Jewish tradition had been addressing Lilith as an individual with specific terms of agreement for long enough that the question of what those terms were, who she was, and why the agreement existed required an explanation. The biography is not an invention, it is an explanation. The tradition's answer to a question it had been implicitly asking since the first amulet invoked her by name, and the first protective agreement was ritually enforced. The distance from the SA.GIG diagnostic series to the Alphabet of Ben Sira, measured in time, is roughly 14 centuries. Measured in theological grammar, it is the distance between a diagnostic type and a biographical individual. between something you manage with institutional ritual and something you negotiate with, bind with agreement, name on amulets, and eventually give a story capacious enough to explain why the negotiation was necessary in the first place. That is what the Exile made possible. Not the transmission of a specific text, the creation of a contact zone, sustained, commercial, administrative, scribal, within which a tradition developing its most elaborate demonological categories could plausibly have encountered the world's most sophisticated existing demonological system at the precise moment when the encounter would be most formative. The Kabbalistic elaboration, Samael as Lilith's cosmic consort, her role in the Q-Aliphoth, the demonic mirror structure of the divine, belongs to the next stage of the transformation and to the episode that follows this one. The SA.GIG diagnostic series, Lilitu in Babylonian medical literature as a ritual medical disease agent with a specific pathological profile, nocturnal affliction, erotic disturbance in men, bodily debilitation, the most ancient layer of documented fear, centuries before the Hebrew word existed. A diagnostic literature, not a mythology. The Ardat Lili as the socially incomplete. A Bush's analysis in Mesopotamian witchcraft, the dead unmarried woman whose unfulfilled social role becomes the source of her demonic function. The Babylonian theology of frustrated social completion as the origin of nocturnal threat, not evil by corruption, dangerous by incompletion. The Maqlu series, 9 tablets, an extended overnight ritual sequence, formally trained a Shipu, performing systematic naming and expulsion. Lilu, Lilitu, and Ardat Lili. Among the figures, the apparatus addresses. Copied in Neo-Babylonian scribal schools during the precise period of Jewish exile. The management apparatus and its transmission vector together in the same place at the same time. The Lamaštu parallel. A divine figure cast from heaven, targeting the pregnant and the newborn, with an amulet tradition operating in a related protective grammar to what developed around Lilith, present in the same Babylonian world, not crossing into the Jewish tradition as a named figure in any comparable form. The contrast as significant as the resemblance, the tradition absorbed what its grammar could transform and left behind what it could not assimilate. The al-Yahudu tablets and the Murašû archive. Jewish communities embedded in Babylonian commercial and administrative life, not isolated observers but daily participants in the civilization whose demonological curriculum could plausibly have been encountered by the scribal class they worked within, proximity documented, transmission inferred, the transformation. A Babylonian ritual medical disease agent category, converted by the Jewish theological grammar into an individual with a name, a story, a grievance, and a negotiated agreement. The distance from the SA.GIG series to the Alphabet of Ben Sira, measured in roughly 14 centuries of theological grammar, doing its work on inherited material. The Babylonian tradition had a word for what Lilitu was. It was not a demon in any vague popular sense. It was a class of pathological agent with a documented profile, a management apparatus, and institutional practitioners responsible for her containment. The tradition knew what it was dealing with. It dealt with it systematically, And then the exile happened, and Jewish communities spent generations inside the world that had built that system, working in its cities, transacting in its legal frameworks, learning in its scribal culture, absorbing its demonological atmosphere without absorbing its explanatory framework intact. What they took back was not the Babylonian system, it was the fear the system was managing, and a tradition that inherits a fear without its explanatory framework has to generate that framework from scratch. The roughly 14 centuries between the exilic encounter with Babylonian demonological tradition and the medieval Alphabet of Ben Sira are the record of that generation. The tradition finally producing a biography capacious enough to explain why it had been afraid, and who exactly it had been afraid of, and what the terms of the arrangement were. The Babylonian tradition called her a type. The Jewish tradition made her a person. The difference between those two moves is not just theological. It is the difference between a disease and a story, between a diagnostic problem and a mythological figure, between something you manage with ritual and something you negotiate with. The name survived in a verse. The amulets gave it terms, the biography gave it a story. The story is still alive.